From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Library of Congress. I think we're ready to go. I'm Ann Bonney with the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress, and one of our major duties is to promote books, reading, libraries, and literacy. One way we do that is through our Books and Beyond series, and that's what we're doing today. Paul is here to speak. Another way we do this is through the National Book Festival. We plan to have over 100 authors here again this year. They will be here on September 22nd and 23rd on the National Ball. And later this month, we are hopefully releasing a list of authors confirmed to date. This program is being filmed for later broadcast on the library website and the Center for the Book website. So if you ask a question during the Q&A, you may be on the film. The Humanities and Social Science Division is co-sponsoring the event with us. Darren Jones is here to introduce the author. Darren is a reference librarian in the division where he serves as the recommending officer in sports and education. He is one of several librarians who provide expert reference assistance in the main reading room. Darren has worked at the Library of Congress since 1990. I've got a few years on him. He lives in the District of Columbia with his wife, LaVon, and his son, Derek. Let's welcome Darren Jones.
Good afternoon, everybody. As Ann said, I'm Darren Jones. Guess you were looking for Dave Kelly, who's been the sports specialist here for 40 years. Well, I'm the new Dave Kelly. Paul Dickson was born in Yonkers, New York, and graduated from Wesleyan University in 1961. He was honored by his alma mater as a distinguished alumni in 1996. After graduation, he served in the U.S. Navy and later worked as a reporter for McGraw-Hill Publications. Since 1968, Paul has been a full-time freelance writer, contributing articles to various magazines and newspapers, including Smithsonian, Esquire, The Nation, Town and Country, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Washington Post. He has written numerous books on a wide range of subjects. Paul is the author of more than 55 nonfiction books and hundreds of magazine articles. Although he has written on a variety of subjects, from ice cream to kite flying to electronic warfare, he now concentrates writing about American language, baseball, and 20th century history. In addition to his new book, Bill Veeck, Baseball's Greatest Maverick, which we'll hear him discuss today, Paul has written the baseball books, The Unwritten Rules of Baseball, The Hidden Language of Baseball, How Signs and Sign Stealing Have Influenced the Course of Our National Pastime, The Joy of Keeping Score, Baseball's Greatest Quotations, Baseball, the President's Game, and the Dickson Baseball Dictionary, which is now in its third edition. The original Dickson Baseball Dictionary was awarded the 1989 Macmillan Sabre Award for Baseball Research. Paul is the former president and founding member of Washington Independent Writers and a member of the National Press Club. He is a consulting editor for Doby Publications Incorporated and a contributing editor at Washingtonian Magazine. Paul lives in Garrett Park, Maryland with his wife, Nancy, who works with him as his first-line editor and financial manager. Many of you know Paul as a frequent Library of Congress researcher. Many others of you know him as an interesting guy. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you today the interesting guy, Mr. Paul Dickson.
Thanks, Ann. Thanks, Darren. I'll try to be as interesting as I can. I'm really happy to be here because I got to talk about the library for a second, then we'll talk about Bill Veeck. At age 68, I decided that I was going to teach myself how to write a biography, and it's sort of like, I mean, not to be immodest about it, but it's sort of like deciding at 68 you want to build a house or something, and it's a totally different skill, you know. And one of the first things that occurred to me was that if you took 10 Pulitzer Prize-winning biographers and asked them to all do Ben Franklin or all do Babe Ruth or all do, you know, anybody, that you would come up with 10 different Ben Franklins and 10 different Babe Ruths because you know they're all going to look for primary sources and they're all going to try to find as much fresh material as they can, even though these things have been worked over many times. You're always looking for that new material, and I basically had to teach myself how to do this, and also I was a little bit afraid of it because, you know, you can do a big thesis-based history book. You can say that the proximate cause of the Peloponnesian Wars was a lack of cellophane, and somebody will actually take you seriously, you know, because the theses are now hot. You can do almost anything you want. But when you're doing a biography, it's sort of like holding a bird in your hand. If you do it wrong, you crush the bird. And you have other obligations because you're really working with a real person who has a real family and a real, you know, widow who's still alive and a bunch of kids that are still alive and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And so, but you also don't want to make it into a honorific to this person. You want to do it as strictly as good a biography as you can. So. So that's where the library comes in. And well, the library, there's tons and tons and tons and tons of secondary source material on a guy like Bill Veeck. And when I approached it, I knew I ended up filling 6 banker's boxes with clippings and, you know, all the stuff that everybody else in the universe has access to. But the library had the stuff that really made a tremendous difference in the book. And if you look at the book, not the cover, but many of the pictures in the book, the back cover, there's the picture of Veeck facing you. These all came from the Library of Congress. They all came from the Look magazine collection. These are all photographs that were originally contact sheets. And there was one of the photographers really had fallen in love with Veeck, had done 5 sessions with Veeck. So I had about 600-700 contacts to deal with Veeck. Again, the majority of the photographs in the book are from that collection. The cover photo is also a Look photo, but some of the early Look stuff ended up at Cooperstown. So again, it's really the same collection. And in doing that, I was able to see a whole lot of stuff that I hadn't seen before because I'm, you know, day after day of going through contacts with a magnifying glass, you actually see him. Sometimes in those days they would shoot, you know, 36 tri-X photos inside a room, and you'd see his relationship with Hank Greenberg. You'd see his relationship with Larry Doby. It was almost like you were watching a slow motion film. So that was one thing, but the real big thing was finding in the recorded division, recorded sound, and it was in the catalog, but I didn't really see it at first. You know, sort of going through the catalog. All of a sudden, it says 320 5-minute broadcasts of Bill Veeck which he did for Armed Forces Radio. So I go, you know, it's somewhere in Culpeper or something. They cue them up on a machine. And I go into this recording booth and I put the earphones on and I listened to, for a day and a half, I listened to him talk. And I was taking notes from them, and so I had to back up and I listened to him again. And when I came out of that day and a half of listening to this guy, I knew how he talked. I knew if a quote that he made was bogus. Because it was all extemporaneous, so I'd heard his voice. The family doesn't know these exist. Nobody knows these exist. I mean, the library does because they put them in the catalog, but the fact is, in terms of primary source material, and it was also just learning his speech patterns, the man could not say woman. He'd say the female of the species. He could not say, and he also had a Victorian way of speaking. He would not say that somebody was an inept infielder or an outfielder. He could not say that. He would say he was no gazelle of the greensward. And he couldn't call anybody, he had to call everybody by their first name. And he would say these outrageous things on this radio show. And I'm getting fresh quotes. And the coup de grace was, I'll get into this in a second, but Veeck had gone a very extraordinary motion. In 1942, he tried to buy the Philadelphia Phillies and convert them into an all-black team that would then Cool Papa Bell, Josh Gibson, Satchel Paige, on down the line. These guys, there's 42, the war is on, but the African-American guys were all older and therefore deferred from the draft or excused at that point of the war. And he knew he could just mop up the leagues with them. But he's prevented from doing this by the powers that be. They're just not ready to have an all-black team go out there and beat everybody else up on the field. But in recent years, some scholars claimed that this was all false based on, they couldn't find any evidence that it was true. And they literally, in a scholarly article, called him a liar, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was fascinated because I started listening to a lot of oral history, some here, but most of the other library collections had a lot of oral history. And I listened to him tell the story again and again and name the train he was on when he tried to do this. But I realized that these guys they had come up with a thesis. They believed that Veeck was a liar, therefore they're going to prove he was a liar, but therefore they looked at all the places there was no information. The library provided me with stuff, pieces of information, a little pamphlet that was produced in Chicago on race and sports, that it's not on Google, it hasn't been digitized, it's not on Wikipedia, it's not on any digital source. But I found it it was there for me to find, it was in the catalog. But I got it here. I mean, I physically brought it down and actually took notes. And for an analog person in a digital age, it was phenomenal because this was one of the key pieces of evidence, and it would not have been available to me, and probably as close as I could get to my version of the smoking gun, which is that he really did try to do this, and it really was true. And there are a lot of the reasons why I came to this conclusion, and I was open-minded about it. But again, the value of the library, and I sound like I'm doing an infomercial for the Library of Congress, but the value of the library for this kind of stuff, and I think the other thing I got to say is at the top of all this is there are so many people thanked in here. Tom Mann, Abby Yackelson, I mean, up and down the line. But that really helped me with people in current periodicals. Gary, I see you back there, the periodical reading room. But it was, the other thing was I dedicated the book to Nancy, my wife, and I also dedicated it to Dave Kelly for decades of service to writers, because Dave could always find stuff, and Dave loved this subject, loved the stuff, was always looking for something for me that wasn't in the normal, sort of ritual of what a researcher does. And to this day, and Darren now wears this cap, but to this day, if I look at a new sports biography or a book about sports, and Kelly's not in there to thank you, I figure the guy wasn't working as hard as he could because you got to do Dave. Bill Veeck, the reason I picked Bill Veeck was a transformational character in the history of baseball and also in the history of the country. He was a man who was born into a wealthy family. His father was president of the Chicago Cubs. His father was a brilliant writer who may have been onto the fact, and there's significant evidence that he was onto the fact that the 1918 World Series was fixed. That was between the Cubs and the Red Sox. And at some point, he was made president of the Cubs when the Wrigleys took over. And I posit in the book, and I think I pretty much show that the reason that he was given this job, he's a newspaper guy, all of a sudden he's running a major league ball club. And that the reason they brought him aboard was because he could clean up baseball. Baseball was corrupt. The 1919 World Series was fixed. In 1920, when he takes over the Cubs, he finds gamblers actually trying to fix game. He's getting tips from other gamblers that another gambler is trying to fix the game. He's getting calls from gamblers saying so-and-so's already got their pitchers, your pitcher's been compromised, et cetera, et cetera. Veeck, at 1920, calls for a grand jury investigation of the particular incident. All of a sudden, the grand jury now is going into the 1919 World Series, which is the huge, they call them the Black Sox. This was the great scar on baseball's history because there was corruption. So Veeck comes into the son of this guy who also very early on decided that women had to be part of the marketing and the part of the group of baseball. He introduces ladies' days. He does huge promotions for women, and he does. Then of course he knows they're going to start bringing the kids with them, and then the family's going to come. And she's changed. Those old pictures of baseball where you see nothing but guys out there in the white shirts and on the fedoras or whatever they were, straw hats. He changed that. And he also was the first guy to promote a woman to an executive front office position in baseball. So he was very close to all this stuff. And early on, he had also had some discussions or there were some discussions made with him of the idea that you put a black team in the National League and a black team in the American League, and all of a sudden the attendance skyrockets. And in my research, I actually found that there were people like Babe Ruth and Walter Johnson who were very much in favor of putting these black teams in each league because they felt that they were always being compared to these other players, but they could never play with them, against them. So Walter Johnson, is he the greatest right-handed pitcher in the world, or isn't he? Is Babe Ruth really the greatest slugger, or isn't he? And so these guys, the white guys, they want to do this, with the major exception of Ty Cobb, who is a bona fide dyed-in-the-wool racist. But Veeck Sr. dies in 1933. He dies of leukemia in his later days. He's so popular in Chicago, the older Veeck, that the word goes out on the street. Prohibition's in full force, and word goes out on the street that he loves French champagne and would love to have some French champagne to sip on as he passes his final days on this earth. And a crate of champagne arrives at the front door one day with compliments of Al Capone. So I think mine's the only baseball book that has in the index Martin Luther King Jr., Al Capone, Salvador Dali, and Howard Hughes. That's how I got Capone into it. It was a game I was playing to get all these people in. So Veeck takes over. He gets the Wrigley's. He quits college, walks out of college. He's got to start making a living. He gets a job with the Cubs. The first job they give Wrigley gives him, who owns the Cubs, is to go around the stadium and find out what the fans really want, how to make them happy. In the meantime, he comes up with these interesting characters that becomes his friends. One's a ballpark hustler, sells scorecards named Jack Ruby. The other's a guy who sells paper cups to him that he's running some of the concessions, named Roy Kroc, who later starts McDonald's. And there are all these other characters like Abe Saperstein, who owns the Globetrotters. They're hanging around with him. He's getting to know George Halas. He's working for George Halas on the side. And Veeck is now immersed in this culture of promotion and new ideas. Then Wrigley says to him, 37, all right, the ballpark's a mess. The Wrigley Field is just a mess. Come on in, fix the place. So he said, get contractors, bring in, here's your budget. So does it. He totally reconfigures Wrigley. They rip out the outfield walls. They widen the seats. They build in concession stands. They plant a bunch of ivy. They create an iconic look. And they create a little signal if you're on the elevated and the Cubs have won, there's one signal, one light, and if they've lost, there's another signal. And so people going home on the elevator would know who won the game that day. And this is all Veeck's doing. I mean, if you walk into Wrigley today and you come through those portals, I'm going to be there tonight. You walk through those portals and you see that thing open up to you. That's all he's doing. And he's a kid. He's just out of, in the meantime, he wants to run a ball club. And in 41, we're going to come to the point in a minute where I said the rest is history. But he takes over he takes over the Milwaukee Brewers, which is this down and out, terrible, miserable, no attendance ballpark in Milwaukee, where I'm going to be on Thursday. And he basically, with no money, and he creates this unbelievable attraction. First, he does this every ballpark he takes over. First thing he does is he rips out the ladies' rooms, the powder rooms, whatever you call them, takes out the fluorescent lighting, which he, as he said, I know this is stereotypical behavior, but ladies don't like fluorescent lights when they're out in company. And he rips out the fluorescent lights, puts in soft lighting, makes them much bigger. They don't have to wait outside. And he starts promoting the ballparks to women. Immediately, every place he goes, that's the first thing he does. But he gets to Milwaukee and he starts these bizarre promotions. He's giving away live pigs, braces of chickens, kegs full of nails. He once said it's one thing to give 10,000 fans a can of beer, but if you give one fan 10,000 cans of beer, it's funny. I mean, he would do things like he'd say, the lucky fan tonight will get 100 silver dollars, and some kid would get this thing, 100 silver dollars, 1941, and he gets 100 silver dollars, and the wheelbarrow comes out this mammoth block of ice, and the kid's got to wait all night for the ice to melt so that you get it. And then he does something extraordinary. The war's really going on in earnest now. Milwaukee's in a 3-shift city. There's huge industrial production going on for the war, munitions, et cetera, in Milwaukee. And Veeck decides to have stage games for the 3rd shift, which means 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock in the morning games, 3rd shift coming off work at that time. And of course, everybody in baseball is just torn inside out. You can't do that. It's against tradition. You can't start a game at 8 o'clock in the morning. Well, he does it in such a way. He's got Charlie Grimm, his manager, in a bed, and they wake him up, and Veeck's at the door handing out Wheaties with strawberries, and of course everybody, and the league is just furious. They say you can't do this. This is a horrible thing. But Connie Mack, who at that time was sort of the grand old man of baseball, who ran the Philadelphia Athletics at that time, he actually came out and said, Veeck did this is a great idea. He's going to change this game. He's going to do a lot of promotion. And Veeck was then all of a sudden, those of you who are old enough to remember how important the magazines were. Within a couple months of that, he's in the Saturday Evening Post. Look, the picture on the cover of the book is from that's right after that incident. He's Saturday Evening Post, Look, Esquire, and Collier's. So in 44, he decides out of the blue, this is all going well. He tries, 42, he tries to buy the Phillies, which again was thwarted. He wanted to produce an all-black team. He'd been working with integration. When in late 41, Abe Saperstein gives him the franchise for the Harlem Globetrotters in the Upper Midwest. At that time, the Harlem Globetrotters was not a stunt team. They were like the Harlem Renaissance, which is another team. They were straight-up basketball. The clowning and the stunts came later. They were playing in the equivalent of the National Basketball Association. It hadn't become that then, but the Detroit Pistons were in there and other teams that came out of the NBA. All of a sudden, the winter of 41, 42, the black teams start trading to the white teams. The white start trading to the black teams. He's watching integrated basketball. Professional basketball is integrated 41, 42. Nobody ever hears about this. But it is also, he just sees the gate receipts go through the roof. It's fascinating. He says, all of a sudden, I'm putting on a show. Everybody wants to see this. And so, he'd see the value of integration. I mean, from a strictly business standpoint, forgetting all the morality of it, he also saw it and Abe Saperstein was also very much in on this. So that's when he and Saperstein tried to buy the Phillies in 42. And he knows they're not ready for integration. But what he was really driving at with the Phillies was sort of a racial equality, where you could basically put together a whole black team, a whole team, in this case, in the National League, and they could compete as a team. And again, he was thwarted from that. And then after that happened, he again was winning big in Milwaukee. He made this great team. Out of the blue one night, he decides he's going to join the Marines. He says, I could have been deferred, but I'm going to go in anyhow. I'll prevent some younger guy who doesn't have any money, who's got kids. I'll take his place. I'll go in. The Marines want to use him as a sort of a showboat. No way will they let him do that. He said, no, I want to go into combat. Demands to go into combat. Goes into combat and gets in the South Pacific in a combat zone. And he is, I actually found his sergeant who was in charge of him. Sergeant was now in a nursing home in Wisconsin. I found him and he said, I've never seen anyone like Veeck. He said he'd go out there and he'd hurl, the Japanese line was about 350 yards away, and he said he'd go out there and yell insults in the middle of the night at the Japanese, attracting fire. And then he said he would And he said one day, all of a sudden, a plane arrives in this combat zone. And it all of a sudden loads all these bats and balls and gloves. He said, to this day, nobody knows how he could get all this baseball equipment into a combat zone. And another time, apparently, he went out, Pappy Boyington, the famous flyer, flew in, and Veeck went out and came back with, I think, 2 bottles of scotch and 2 eggs. And the eggs were more valuable than the scotch because they were so rare. But, and again, he gets wounded. There's an accident with a howitzer, a 155 millimeter aircraft gun, comes back, hits his foot is damaged, badly cut. You're in a horrible zone in terms of disease and viruses and germs and things. It gets infected, and he goes through a long process which will last the rest of his life. 16 major amputations, many more minor sort of trimmings. The amputations affect his ears, they affect everything, and he's living this whole life with this amazing pain, which is one of the reasons he's also such a compelling figure, because he uses the pain, and it's intense. The more I talk to his kids, you realize every day he'd get up and soak the stump of what he had left of a leg, and because the calluses from the prostheses were so intense. But in the middle of all this, it's a joke. I mean, not a joke, it's a sight gag. He builds an ashtray. He gets rid of the stainless steel prostheses. He can't stand it after all. It's too painful. He has a wooden leg. He looks like a pirate. And he has a ashtray built into the wooden leg. And in the middle of a negotiation, in those days, people smoked in meetings, he'd pull out his leg and pull out the thing and snuff out a cigarette. And one of his kids told me one point he was living on the Eastern Shore later in his life, and he had all this deck paint in the house. So as the summer progressed, he would paint the wooden leg so it looked like his tan was getting more intense. But his greatest line is he's running through the Baltimore airport. Late in his life, he's covering the World Series. This is after he's owned 4 Major League franchises. He's brought back by USA Today to cover the World Series, and he's running through the Baltimore airport, and he falls, and he's sprawled out on the corridor there, and a woman from the airline comes running up and says, Mr. Veeck, and we get you a doctor. And she says, no, it's my wooden leg, get me a carpenter. So this is the kind of guy he goes on to own the Cleveland Indians. After it comes out of the war, he's going through he's been many months in the VA hospital. After the war, he buys the Cleveland Indians for $1.5 million with a lot of other people's money, including Bob Hope, one of the comedian, one of his partners. Becomes the world champion, wins the world championship in '48. Does it by bringing in the first African American in the American League, Larry Doby. 11 weeks after Jackie Robinson is brought up, he brings up Larry Doby. Veeck was trying to actually bring another African American player in that winter, a guy named Roy Dandridge, who wouldn't come. He was playing in the Mexican League, making tons of money, but he wanted to bring him in. And Veeck also knew he was going to integrate very fast, because he hires before that season in '47, when Jackie Robinson's brought up, he hires the first African American front office person. He hires a PR person who was also Lena Horne's husband. So he's well known in Cleveland. He's a celebrity in his own right. But he's brought in to get the city ready for integration of the team. And it's going to be a tough hoe. I mean, a tough road to hoe, because Cleveland is multi-ethnic and there's a lot of resistance. Veeck claims 20,000 angry letters when he brings Doby up. I found a guy who worked on the newspaper. He said that the hate calls that newspapers were getting, Veeck just brings up Doby, just brings him up. He's ready to go. Doby probably has a tougher time in a lot of ways than Jackie Robinson, because Doby, who has become, when he comes to Washington, for example, he said he heard the N-word so many times he started to think it was his middle name. It was just brutal. And one game, he's playing an exhibition game in Houston, and they actually drive him off the field. He's in uniform on first base, and he's driven off the field with rocks. And he comes back the next day, and they're booing, and he hits a home run. And he says, I resented they cheer. And he said, I resented those cheers, because they weren't cheering me as a human. They were cheering me, they were cheering my bat. It was. And Doby was interesting. Doby came from a middle-class family. He grew up in he grew up in a very well-to-do suburb of New Jersey. He was I think it was class vice president. He was captain of the football team. He played against, he was in the same school as Frank Lautenberg, the last senator, who is, I think, under the GI Bill. He played, interestingly enough, he played football against Buzz Aldrin, which is a nice paradigm because Aldrin was the second on the moon and Doby was the second African American in baseball. But he doesn't know. He knows. Then he also goes to Long Island University. He plays basketball on a predominantly white team, and he goes in the Navy. But that's segregated. But there's no race hatred. It's only when he gets to baseball that the hatred comes at him, and it makes it rougher for Doby. And then what Veeck does to make it even more juicy and interesting, and Veeck can have a special relationship with Doby because Doby had to be protected more because he just wasn't ready for this hate. That was he could stand segregation, he couldn't stand the hatred. And so then Veeck does the unspeakable, and the next day at 48, when he wants to win the world championship. In 48, he brings in Satchel Paige. And the powers that be are furious because for decades they've been saying, these Negro League guys, they can't play with us. They're not as good as we are. They're just showmen. They just go out there and clown. They're not great players. All of a sudden, he's bringing up an old man, Satchel Paige, and he knows that if Satchel Paige makes it, all these other guys are going to have to eat crow or eat Jim Crow, as the case may be. But they're all going to have to, realize that this guy is great. And he comes up, and of course, he helps them win the World Championship, helps them win the World Series. And all those teams that won't integrate, I don't even are saying they're not going to, the New York Yankees, the Boston Red Sox, the Detroit Tigers. Veeck is now really going after them for this thing. And in 40, he wins the World Championship with those two guys. In 48, 49, he brings 14 African-American players to spring training. Minnie Minoso, Luke Easter, et cetera, et cetera. Some of those guys made it, but he now believes that the salvation of baseball is integration. But he gets huge pushback at this point. But that, I think, is one of his great moments was the Yankees are saying, we're not going to integrate. He has the Yankees, and they have Satchel Paige pitching, and they put him in every seat in the stadium. He said it wasn't one of his great days because there's the Yankees saying, "Oh, we don't want to integrate baseball," but Paige could pack Yankee Stadium. And I know there's probably some people that aren't big baseball fans, but he goes on to own the St. Louis Browns, where he changed baseball in another way. He at one point he brought up an actor, a guy who played midgets on the stage for a living, as a batter. And Veeck had read earlier a James Thurber short story in which a baseball team, whenever they needed to get somebody on base, they would have a midget come in and crouch so that the size of their strike zone was about this big, and they would get walked. So Veeck does this with a guy named Eddie Goodell, and as politically incorrect as it sounds today, it was sensational at the time. Goodell was not a victim. Goodell loved this role. He made a huge amount of money from it. This is what he did for a living. And he had a great South Side accent, Chicago. He'd go on the Milton Berle show, and he said, I could have been Babe Ruth. That was, and the whole of baseball is up in arms. He's ruined the sanctity of baseball by putting this tiny guy in the game. And of course, what happens is the picture of him pitching to Goodell in the game, crouching, it just appears all over the world. Every English-speaking newspaper, every foreign-speaking newspaper has this picture. And of course, what Veeck is doing is getting baseball sort of ready for the television age. All of a sudden, baseball, which was losing at the television at that point, all of a sudden gets this boost from just this idea that I go to a ball game tomorrow, and you don't know what's going to happen. There could be a midget, there could be and he does a lot of other. His team, the team the Browns are finally brought to, they can't make it. He can't make them work financially in St. Louis, and eventually they're brought to they become the Baltimore Orioles. He's not allowed to bring them to Baltimore, but they become the Baltimore Orioles. He then later takes on, buys the Chicago White Sox. In the meantime, actually, he does one other real quick thing. He works for the National League hires him to get baseball ready for the West Coast, and so he gets baseball ready for the West Coast. Does a huge impact on it, gets everything ready so that National League gets Los Angeles and San Francisco. The American League, which didn't hire Veeck to set it all up, gets Anaheim and Oakland, which are fine cities, but they're not the major markets. Then he gets very sick. This part of his life, he gets very sick. He's forced to sell the White Sox. This is after having a phenomenal pennant-winning series in 1969, in which they ring all of the civil defense alarms go out and off. And I know many people who were there. There's a political guy here in that town named Mark Plotkin, and Mark Plotkin, he's watching the television. They win the pennant. Yeah, Tom. So they win the pennant. And Mark's on his way to bed, and he says, they win the pennant, and it's on TV in Cleveland, and Mark's on his way to bed, and all of a sudden, the civil defense sirens goes on, and he said, the White Sox finally win the pennant, and I'm going to die in a thermonuclear attack tonight. And again, he does these outrageous things. I mean, when in '76, when he takes over the White Sox again, he's got... They reenact the Spirit of '76, the famous painting with the guy with the flute and the guy, the three guys. And of course, he's out there with the peg leg, the drum, and he's playing the role. He gets real sick, and he has to sell the White Sox. He goes down to the Eastern Shore ostensibly to die. He doesn't die. In fact, hundreds of reporters would go down there to get their last interview with him, and of course, he would then prevail. And a lot of great stuff. Even the reporters are still alive that I talked with about this. But he ends up during that period, he's out of baseball. He buys a racetrack up near Boston, gets involved in saving Fenway Park, which was slated for demolition at one point. We're going to make a big, huge cookie cutter stadium. Gets involved in keeping the Patriots in Boston. He's involved in everything. When George Preston Marshall will not integrate the Redskins, and they're playing in a federal park, Veeck goes to the Secretary of the Interior, Udall, who is his headache is he's got a Jim Crow team in a federal stadium in the nation's capital, and Veeck goes in and says to Udall, he says, "Look, it's easy, throw him out, and I'll get an American Football League team, and we'll bring him in." And of course, he never does it, but he just would give Udall that tool, and so. Then he goes back, and finally he owns the White Sox again and does pretty well with them. He's fought all of his life against the reserve clause, which is the one that is sort of the indentured servitude that held a player to one club for his career. And Veeck, at 18, writes a letter to Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis and says that reserve clause is immoral and illegal. And he fights for it all his life to get rid of it, reserve clause. And he actually testifies at Curt Flood's trial, which is the trial that leads up to the whole change in creating free agency. Then when he takes over the White Sox, all of a sudden there's free agency and he can't afford the players. So he's bitten by his own morality, for lack of a better, his own principles. But he does a magnificent job. He has a rent-a-player. He takes guys in their last months of being in the reserve clause. And he ends sort of ingloriously. He and Mike, his son, Mike Veeck, who's still very much of a character, he owns a bunch of ball clubs with Bill Murray. Mike does the same kind of promotions his father did. Mike, when he took over the St. Paul's Saints, he said he couldn't afford instant replay, so he hired mimes and leotards to reenact the play. But they hold this thing with an ill-conceived idea in the history of baseball. They hold a thing called Disco Demolition Night. Between the halves of a double header, they're going to burn this huge bonfire of disco music. There's this wacko disc jockey and Mike come on this idea, and Bill is having still another amputation. He comes out of the Mayo Clinic to come to see this thing, and of course, everything goes wrong, and the records are being thrown from the upper decks like the blades from a buzzsaw, and there's fires being built, and Ernie Harwell, I think it was maybe the last interview he gave, he was in the booth and he said there was so much booze and so much pot, emphasis on the pot, that he said there was a cloud over Comiskey Park that night. It was so much marijuana, and the crowd was there they built fires, and it was a disaster. And then he goes on and becomes sort of he sells the White Sox. It sort of becomes the grand old man of baseball. And I went through a lot of this and a lot of other things in the book, but I think Just a final thing about Veeck and why, and then we'll do the questions. And I'm probably running. No, I'm not. He said, "Oh, I'm probably running. I'm probably just on time." The thing that Veeck did was he changed baseball. Hank Greenberg, the great Detroit Tiger slugger and business associate of Veeck's, says at the end of his life, he said, when Veeck dies, he said, before Veeck, it was just going to the ball game and winning or losing. Veeck made it fun. Veeck did stuff nobody was expecting it. When he just, and I think one of the things he did in the process is create this huge fan base of women and children and minorities that didn't exist before him. And I think one of the reasons the Los Angeles Dodgers sold a couple of weeks ago for $2 billion is because Veeck had built this enormous fan base. What he did, I have one other example of this thing with women. Right in 46, nylon stockings are a black market item. You can't get them. They're nowhere. They're in tremendously short supply. So Veeck somehow commandeers a truckload of nylon stockings, and he has a nylon stocking night. Any woman comes to the ballpark that night, gets a nylon stocking. There's almost riots, and all the powers that be in baseball are saying, "What's next? What if you're standing out? Is it going to be pantyhose night? What's going to be next? Well, how far can you go with this guy?" And of course, then he gets it. Well, this is cool. On Mother's Day, he flies in a huge plane load of orchids. And dancers from Hawaii, and every woman gets an orchid. But it was just the fact that he saw just one other thing in Cleveland. Because I interviewed a guy who was at his first ball game at 2. Veeck builds a huge nursery in the ballpark, and clears out all these executive offices and build a nursery so you can bring an infant to the game. So I think he did that. I think the other thing that he did. The owners hated him, and I asked Andy McPhail, they hate him because he was so progressive. He really nailed them on race. He really nailed them on free agency. He really nailed them on even tax codes. He was way ahead of everybody. He learned to depreciate the value. He looked at the old depletion allowance, and he learned to devalue the value of a pitcher. As the pitcher got older, he could take more of a tax write-off for the pitcher and of course that upset the other owners because they thought it would cost them the antitrust exemption. But when the dust settled, I asked Andy McPhail, whose father and grandfather had been great baseball people, both in the Hall of Fame. I asked him, who had grown up with him, and I said, "Why do they hate him so much?" And McPhail said, they really hated was he sat in the bleachers with the fans. Every game he sat in the bleachers. And a kid would come up and say, "Hey, Mr. Veeck, the hot dog's lousy." And Veeck would give him, he'd say, "Here's a couple bucks, get another one." He did this. If a team lost, he would be, in Cleveland, they were running for the world championship. And they'd lose one night, and he'd go outside the gates and shake hands with everybody and thank them for coming. And McPhail said, if one owner today sat in the cheap seats with the fans, it would be revolutionary. And I think Veeck's influence is tremendous, but I think the bottom line for me is that he put a smile on baseball's face. It was just a different game after he finished with it. So we have a few minutes for questions. Yes, sir.
Paul, I have one question. You briefly mentioned it, but the antitrust exemption that baseball has, did he have a stance on that, or did he ever?
He couldn't care less. He thought it was unfair to the other sports, and he also at one time Emmanuel Seller, who's on that committee that's looking into the antitrust, he says something about all the other owners are just petrified. That something will happen. And Emmanuel Seller says that Veeck's not playing his players enough. Instead of saying, "Oh, thank you for that bit of advice," he tells him, he says, "Hey, it's none of your business when I play my players." And one of I think they were petrified they'd lose that from it. And I think that's what made him so dangerous. And even when he depreciates the value of the players, very few people got this, but this year's basketball strike, that was part of it, because from then on, these professional teams were depreciating the value of an athlete as their talents declined. And the basketball players are saying, wait a second, the owners are making more money on us as we deteriorate as players, hence, why aren't we getting a piece of that action? That was sort of, only a couple writers really picked up that was one of the points of real anger between the players and the owners and the basketball strike. And that was something, a bomb that, that Veeck had lit the fuse for. Yes, sir.
Two questions, one large and one very small. The larger question would be, obviously Veeck was one of the greatest owners in terms of promotional abilities, but how would you assess him as an owner, building winning teams and hiring the right people?
Well, I mean, could give you two examples. I think he had a tremendous eye for acquiring players and developing them. I think he used to hire college kids in the summer to go to the library and do statistical analysis, almost like a precursor to the Sabre concept. Two examples that are great. One, the second time he owns the White Sox, he needs a manager. He hires this lawyer. Everybody goes nuts. You're hiring a lawyer. You should be hiring somebody, go way back in baseball history. You hire this lawyer. Nobody's ever heard of him. That's Tony La Russa. He pulled him out of nowhere. The other one, when he's out on the Eastern Shore, he's quite sick, but he still goes to the Little League games, the high school games, and he spots this player. He said, this guy's going to be he's going to be a Hall of Famer. And so he basically follows the guy, gets back to the White Sox the second time. The equivalent of the draft then comes along, and the first guy he picks is Harold Baines. Everybody says, who's Harold Baines? He said, he's a guy that I've had my eye on him for 8 years. And to complete the picture, when Harold Baines, he brings in Baines, who's a tremendous player, and the first thing he does with Baines, from this little town on the Eastern Shore, he gets him an agent so that Baines can get good money, and then he hires a financial advisor. And he says, I don't want to see this man see so many young athletes lose all the money because they've never been, given an advisor to watch him. And the Baines family now has significant properties on the Eastern Shore. Mrs. Baines, his wife, is now a partner in a major real estate firm down there. He took care of his players. Somebody said the other day, how was he different than Charlie Finley? The big difference was he really loved his players. And so there's an interview in the beginning of the book with Virgil Trucks. He said, I was fired 5 times. In fact, the only one who called me into his office. What was the second one? Okay.
The second question would be, if Veeck owned the Nationals, you think at this point he would have let Teddy win a race?
Yeah, they would. He would have. That's a good point. He probably would have let Teddy win a race. Jonathan Yardley wrote a piece when the Nationals first came, saying they really needed was Veeck. They needed spontaneity, and I had this. This is a little bit risque, but I'll do it anyhow. So my idea, remember those early days when the seats behind home plate were empty? Yeah. If Veeck had owned the Nationals, he would have had male and female inflatable people back there. And anyone who came, any single person who came to the game, got to take one home as a date. So, yes, sir. Oh, yes, sir.
Are there any owners today that could have an impact of changing the way the game operates?
No, I mean, I think there are a lot of it is now in the minor leagues, but I think they keep Mark Cuban out. I think there are people there's nobody really like him anymore. And there's no, Veeck would have looked at today these jumbotrons spewing commercials and these overamped rock and roll between innings that you can't talk to anybody. To them, that wouldn't be spontaneous, or shooting, T-shirts into the stands. I mean, he would have done wild stuff. He would have had belly dancers for the 7th inning stretch. I mean, he would have done stuff that would be, he would have had horses on the field and camels, and it would be different. Yes, sir.
Did Veeck himself have anything to do with the air raid sirens? It just sounds like something he would have had a finger in, but I've never heard of a connection.
I think it was pretty much Mayor Daley who we had to dance around. There's a story in the book where again, Mark Plotkin is running Eugene McCarthy's campaign, and McCarthy wants to come in and pitch for the White Sox and just have a try, you get in uniform and just warm up with the team and then leave the field. And Mark calls up Veeck, and Veeck says, I got to say no. He said, Mayor Daley would never allow it. He said he was...
We know of all his success in the promotional arena. In the overall assessment, how did he make out financially with the clubs that he owned? Did he make money, and did he increase their value?
He did. The shining example is the Indians, which he buys in 46 and sells in 49. One of the reasons he has to sell the Indians is because he was being taxed at a 90% confiscatory tax rate at that time. It was because in his tax bracket it was a 90%, and he just had to get some money together. He was going through a divorce. He had a lot of other things. But when he sold the Indians, he sold guys like Bob Hope and some people from Chicago who are investors. They got $20 on the dollar. And so he always sort of came out with more money, and he never had much money himself, but he always got a lot of people to invest in the club. And he got people like, it was a diversity. I mean, he grows up in a very rarefied atmosphere, an Episcopalian country club, Hinsdale, going to the best private schools in the country, but he gets into baseball, and he's basically, he loves people who are not like himself. So guys like Hank Greenberg become a partner, and Abe Saperstein, and Doby becomes a really close friend. So he brings these people into the ownership. He brings Greenberg in. He brings the first African-American owner into the publisher of Ebony magazine, named Johnson. He brings him as the first, he's part owner, but he's the first African-American owner. So and everybody who ever invested with him leaves with a smile on their face. He sometimes doesn't get as much because he got to pay off certain debts and things, but I think he was successful, yeah. Sir?
What hobbies did Veeck have? What was he interested in when he wasn't doing baseball?
He would read 4 to 5 books a week. He would come to the American Booksellers Association here and quote Keats and quote from Shakespeare. He could be as erudite as anybody you've ever. He was extraordinarily well read. He loved art. He must have built 700 or 800 mobiles, the moving sculpture. He had exhibits in Chicago at the end of his life of mobiles that he had built, and loved to dabble with painting, loved growing. He had greenhouses when he was in Eastern Shore. He bred orchids, he worked on hybrid plants. He was everything was his oyster. Everything in the world was something to be explored. He could be reading the goofiest comic novel at the same time as he would be rereading War and Peace, but he could talk to anybody, and he would never have an office. As soon as he took over a club, he'd leave the office to somebody. He'd go out in the set up in the corridor, and groundskeeper would come in and say, "Boy, I had a rough day." Veeck would sit him down and he'd talk to him. But then some other guy, professor at the University of Chicago, would come over and he said, "What do you think is the best of the Shakespearean plays?" And Veeck would go on about Lear, at length.
Any other questions?
I cannot think of a more perfect match between an author and a subject. I'm sure Bill Benningham is smiling down, overjoyed that he has such a good biography.
Thank you.
I can't wait to start reading it.
Thank you. I got a Twitter from him last night. Or a tweet.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.